If you're on the train on that very last, but should we
Yeah.
2 minutes? I
Okay,
think she might
yeah,
just be
no
there.
problem. Yeah, okay. No problem.
I'll keep talking.
I was actually afraid I was going to be late because I just found like the entrance that was on the street that was for cars only.
Oh.
And I was like, yeah. And I had like 5 minutes left, so yeah. So should I? But I made it in time, so late.
If you're on the train on that very last, but should we
Yeah.
2 minutes? I think she might just be there.
Yeah, okay. Alright, nice to meet you.
Yeah.
I was going to be late. I found like the entrance that was on the street that was for cars only. And I was like, and I had like 5 minutes left, so yeah. But I made it in time, so late. Alright, nice to meet you. Yeah, so happy to wait for a couple of minutes. It was good. It was good. I actually like went to the so it was the second time I went, and it was much better because of the weather. But I think it was good. Yeah, I think that was a one-off. But yeah, I think it was good. I think
the Wi-Fi policy. But you know, normally I will check this part. And you see, sometimes it's excellent connection, but sometimes it will show different. Yeah. Policy. Normally I will check this part. You see, sometimes it's excellent connection, but sometimes
I heard the voice too.
different.
so. I'm
Like
actually
you're
going back
saying the
to
connection
the
thing?
meeting with people we work with, so they appreciate
But I have only my
they are based in Delhi and they happen to be in Washington as well. There is a real benefit. So
Like you're saying the connection thing?
yeah. So I have to meet with them and then I'm heading back to London
Okay.
tomorrow evening.
Awesome. Yes.
It's been
Cool.
busy.
Okay. Should be clear. Yeah. This is mine. Yeah.
I'll do a brief introduction. First, I would like to thank everyone to be here that took their time to be here. I'm Susanna. I'm Vice President of ITS Student Chapter. And today we have here Laila. Am I saying her name?
That's AitBihiOual.
AitBihiOual.
Yeah.
So Laila is currently a postdoc, research associate at the Transport Strategies Center, TSC, at Imperial College London. She is particularly interested in ex-post evaluations of transport innovations using causal inference methods, addressing distributional concerns, for example, gender, poverty, displacement dynamics, and how work develops a comprehensive analytical understanding of performance to improve the operation, planning, and design of transport system. And today she's going to talk about gender differences in the perception of safety in public transit.
Thank you. So, okay, so first again, I would like to thank you again for attending this talk. I'm well aware that this is a bit of an awkward timing because I don't know if a lot of people are around. But yeah, so thanks for attending this talk. So today I'm going to talk you through one of the latest projects that we have done at Imperial College London that aims at quantifying the gender differences in the perception of safety in public transport with a strong focus on both buses and subways. So, okay, so let me start off by bringing a bit of context. So these three images show so are examples of women-only carriages, respectively in Dubai, Japan, and in Mexico City. And so they indicate that transport providers are well aware that men and women have a different experience of safety when they use public transport. However, the aim of this project is not to quantify whether these methods are efficient or not, but it's just to show that they exist, that they know that this issue exists. Indeed, even from a purely pragmatic point of view, when the safety levels are low, it leads to a reduced ridership, which in turn triggers lower revenues, which is an issue for them. And this matter is going to be even more important across, well, in the coming years, as we are in a century of rapid urbanization, given that 40% of the current metro infrastructure has been built since year 2000, and also 55% of the world's population actually live in urban areas. And so this question is relevant. However, it is subject to an important challenge, which is that there are mismatches between female safety needs and also the solutions that are provided. So a few studies have shown, using small surveys, that men and women have a different perception of what is done to actually increase their feeling of safety. And so that's why it's something that drew our attention and as something that should be quantified. So a couple of words about the literature. The thing is, most of the time the literature is qualitative and much less quantitative, and the thing that has been mostly studied is women's fear of crime in public spaces. So the main results are that women have a greater fear of being in concealed spaces and alone with strangers, and also private spaces are seen as safer than public spaces. So this has been the case. This has been highlighted by people who were a crossway between sociology and psychology, and then showed that it was one of the drivers of women who decided to take their car over other transport routes. However, much less work has been done on safety, but in public transport. So this leads us to the following questions, which are: does perceived safety in public transport differ by gender? And if that's the case, what is the extent of this difference, and is it significant, or which is what will make it relevant? And then, in the second step, what are the potential drivers of those differences? Because we're interested in policy making and overall recommendations to transport providers as well. So, yeah, in this project, we use data that we produced at the Transport Strategy Center at Imperial College. So the first one is a customer satisfaction survey, which is a unique survey that is homogeneous and covers over 30 cities worldwide and goes back to year 2009, and it's a yearly survey. And besides the general sociodemographic variables, it gathers people's opinions on 8 dimensions that are said to describe the characteristics of a metro system and of a bus system. But I'll get into that a bit more later. And then we also use the key performance indicators that are called KPI, which is a data set that is information that we get from transport providers that gather characteristics such as the number of staff, number of carriages, number of metros by line, and so on. And so we use that to then try and extract potential drivers of the feeling of safety. And so, using these 2 data sets, we do 2 things. The first thing is that we do a cross-country analysis, and so we try and see whether there is a gap in the perception of safety between men and women, and we also see if this gap is observed for overall satisfaction. And then we disentangle the potential drivers of observed gender differences. And so in a nutshell, the main results that we find are that women are 10% more likely to state that they feel unsafe in metros, and they are 6% more likely than men to say that they are unsafe in buses. And then when it comes to the potential drivers, we find that all the characteristics that have an impact on average on the population, actually this impact is always magnified for the subpopulation of women, whether the impact is positive or negative. And then in more detail, some are, it's quite straightforward that the higher the number of acts of violence committed in the metro, the more people will say that they are less safe. Also, the more cars per trains, the bigger the capacity within the train, and the bigger the ridership, the more people say that they feel safe in the metro. So, okay, so the contribution of this project is twofold. The first one is the methodology. So we do not assume that women feel massively unsafe in the metros and in the buses. Because the truth is, when it comes to safety, harassment, and all the issues that target particularly the subgroup of women, these are subject to underreporting. So that's why we find sometimes averages of safety that are quite high. So sometimes people say that they are actually neutral despite figures showing that they should feel unsafe. However, what we find is, that's why we look at the gap, because all of the things being equal, we always find a consistent and significant gap between men and women, showing that there is a difference in the priors regarding safety while using the same system. And the gap also accounts for the possibility that also men can also feel unsafe in public transport, and that's not something we ignore here. So we try and look at the gap because we want to show the differences here while acknowledging that potentially men might feel unsafe in public transport. And the second contribution of this paper comes from the data that we use. So we found that in the literature, at least to the best of our knowledge, there's been very little studies using data, and no studies actually gathering and using data on a worldwide scale. So given that we then have over 300,000 interactions, this gives an excellent validity to our results and more power to our coefficients. So yes, so like I said, the literature has been mostly surveys that are often a one-off and at the city level, and so it is sometimes difficult to try and make a general conclusion out of those studies, as they are sometimes designed differently. Like, they rely on surveys that are designed differently. So yes, so a couple of words about the data. So the data that we have is bus data and metro data. It covers respectively 14 cities and 25 cities worldwide. Some of them overlap, some don't. And so the bus data goes back to 2009, and the metro data goes back to 2014. So the data collected for 2019 is still still being completed at the moment, but we expect to actually complete it later on. And so it gathers perceptions over 7 dimensions. Safety is one of them, but you also have availability, reliability, the perception of the environment, comfort, perception of staff, and so on. And well, these two are actually comparable because both of them are designed by our team at TSC, and the statements, the questions asked to people are basically the same. You just replace metro by bus. And yes, and and also both samples are designed in a way that they are representative of the population. So, so we use, given that we use statements, we use an order probit specification because the variables that we use are categorical. And so the statements that are going to be our outcomes, that are like the ones on which we will focus the most, are statements such as trains are a secure place for me. Then, facing the statement, people have to say on a scale of 1 to 5 whether they strongly disagree to strongly agree, with neutral being in the middle. So that's why then we have a categorical variable. And then, so we use the perception of security in trains, in stations, and also the overall satisfaction. Again, it's on a scale of 1 to 5, following a 5-point standard Likert scale. Similarly, for buses, we have the perception of safety, and again, we use also the overall satisfaction. So, of course, we use it in a way that is increasing, so that, the higher the outcome, the more satisfied people are. So, yes, and we also use the standard CT controls, time controls, and so on. So then, we have the following results. As you can see here, the coefficients related to being a woman are negative and significant. And when you look at those two coefficients first, you can see that the gap is significant, and it's pretty much of the same magnitude both for stations and for trains, showing that then we can interpret this as women and men have a perception of the station and of the train, which is quite similar, and it's just a perception of safety in the metro overall. And we also have a gap for the overall satisfaction in metros, but it's of a smaller scale. Again, we can interpret this as the fact that the gap is, well, the perception of overall satisfaction encompasses, again, all the dimensions altogether. The accessibility, the reliability, how easy it is to buy a ticket, how cheap it is, and security is one of those dimensions as well. And when we also do, I also did other analysis trying to measure this gap for the other dimensions, and we never find something of this magnitude, showing that it is security that crystallizes and encompasses the majority, the bulk of the difference in perceptions. And then when it comes to buses, we also see a gap that is of a smaller scale, and again, same dynamic when it comes to the perception of overall satisfaction. The gap is smaller because it's on an average. And so the conclusion here is that women appear to have negative priors when it comes to the perception of safety. But then these coefficients, they come from an ordered probit model, and we cannot interpret those coefficients like that, so we need to compute marginal effects. And so here they are. For buses, when you look at this orange scale, you can see here that this point shows that women have always a bigger propensity to pick the negative statements, and also they're more likely to say that they are neutral, and they are less likely to pick a positive statement compared to men, or other things being equal. And similarly, we find that for the overall satisfaction, this propensity, the same pattern is observed, but is of a smaller magnitude. This is also observed for metros. As you can see here, the magnitude is a bit bigger, and those two lines for stations and for trains are basically merged, which indicates that, again, people have the perception of safety in the metro and maybe don't really disentangle the station versus the actual train. And for the overall satisfaction, the gap again is of a smaller magnitude. So so then when it comes to the quantification, we then can say that women are 10% more likely to say that they are unsafe in metros. They are 6% more likely to say that they are unsafe in buses compared to their male counterparts. And the gap is smaller, and it's of 3% for overall satisfaction for metros and of 2.5% for buses. So as you can see, the gap also is pretty much of the same magnitude for buses and metros when it comes to overall satisfaction. And so then we also did pseudo-panel additional checks to see whether it was consistent, because we have a cross-sectional data, and then we also find similar results, which shows that they are quite robust. And interestingly, we find a gap here, but when it comes to looking at averages, women do not necessarily say that they feel massively unsafe when they take the metro, or the bus, because it can be subject to underreporting and so on. But the idea here and the take-home message is that we just say that they have different priors from the get-go when it comes to safety. And yes, so this graph, when we look at this graph here, we see here an average effect that has been computed using the data put together on a worldwide scale. But is it an average that is actually observed? Like, does it show that the pattern is also observed for all the cities worldwide, or is it just being pushed by one area versus another? So what we do then is that we decompose these effects, and we try to see whether it is observed at a smaller scale. So then we look at these effects for different continents here, and this is the graph here for metros. And so you can see here that the average is the red dotted line, and compared to the blue line, which is for Europe, we can see that again women are more likely to pick negative statements, and they are less likely to pick positive statements, showing that the pattern is observed, but it is actually of a bigger magnitude for European cities. And And conversely, we see that the pattern is also observed for the Asian cities that are composing our sample, but it is of a smaller scale because they are also less likely. The gap is smaller compared to Europe for the negative statements. And similarly, we also find something that is quite comparable, and again the same pattern for buses as well. And for Asian buses, we find something that is which looks a bit like, which is a bit different and quite different from the average. But that's because the sample of Asian cities that we have for the bus data is quite small. So that's probably what makes it a bit more fuzzy in a way. So this indicates that there is a gender gap in the perception of safety, and that's observed on the average, but that's also observed at a smaller scale, which indicates that there is something that there is indeed a gap, and that there is like a sort of external validity to our results. But however, is it driven by the characteristics of the actual public transport? So to do so, we then use the key performance indicators, and that's when they become crucial, because then we can try and decompose the effect. So when we use the KPI data, we have it for metros only. So then we just try and test what are the different drivers that are embedded in the metro characteristics. So we use the following: the number of staff in station, the metro ridership, number of cars per train, stations by line, car capacity, and the number of acts of violence that are committed within the metro. This is something that's reported and given to us by transport service providers. And so we pick those things, and well, we expect them to not really be prone to biases, because these variables are not really correlated much to one another. So then we do the same thing, we use them as controls, and we find the following marginal effects. So we'll decompose them by those who have a positive impact and negative impact. So starting off by the negative impact. So when we look at it, we find that the bigger the number of stations by line, it has a negative impact on individuals' perception of safety. That can be driven by two potential facts, which is that most of the time, in a lot of European cities, the stations that have more stops are the ones that are the oldest. So they might be also the ones that have a lesser lighting, and also that will then have characteristics that make people feel less secure. And also, from a pure abstract point of view, ignoring all the potential other characteristics, when you go from a point A to point B, and then you have a lot of stations to go through between those 2 points, you might think that if something goes wrong, then you're stuck in the metro. So again, this impact is true on average, but it is bigger for women. And when we look at the number of violent acts, we find that it is the magnitude is, it is significant, and it is of a similar magnitude between men and women.
This is also for COVID.
Yes, oh yeah. But we just added these as controls in this, yeah. And so we find, that they are of a similar magnitude. But again, in the number of violent acts, this is the subcategories that compose, is recorded as a violent act: criminal damage, robberies, theft, and actual rapes. So then, it might be because there is no figure regarding harassment. It is not even a subject to underreporting, it's just not reported and not accounted for by transport providers in the data that they gave us. And when it comes to robberies, it has a significant but very, very, very small effect. That is a bit bigger for women, but again, it shows that for the subgroup of women, all the effects are always magnified. And conversely, the characteristics that have a positive impact on the feeling of safety is the metro ridership. So this corroborates what's been found in the literature in the qualitative literature, which is that whether people actually whether they act or not is not the question, but when you have more people around, you tend to feel safer. Just because you might think that they will help you if something goes wrong. Whether they do it or not is another question, but it is something that actually makes people feel safer. And also, the more the number of cars per train, the more people feel safer. Again, there is more of a plan B. If something goes wrong, people can change carriages. And similarly, for the car capacity, this this is the result that we think is quite interesting because, well, car capacity is crucial when it comes to peak time. So basically, at peak times, there is a lot of people who are around, and there is like not so much privacy, and this is when the harassment situations really happen often. So that might be what triggers the increase in the feeling of safety when there is less space in which people can actually move around. So then we decided to isolate those two elements because they have a sort of little category of themselves. Because interestingly, when you look at the average, the number of staff in stations is not really something that's significant. However, if you want to draw the intention and look at the impact on the subgroup of women, you see that when you hire more people that are present in station, people feel safer. So again, when it comes to cost-benefit analysis, more often than not, transport providers just look at the averages, and if they decomposed them, those indicators for special subgroups, maybe they would actually decide to make different decisions.
Can I ask another question for that?
Sure.
So in this case, you're for the women, it's just you're using the same model results, right? You're not segmenting.
So these are coming from two different sets of regressions. That's for the total population and for the subgroup of women. Yeah. So yes, so the take-home message is the following. We find a gap of 10% for metros, 6% for buses, and the gap is of a smaller magnitude for the overall satisfaction. And so it shows that women have different priors than men on the perception of security in public transport. So then it might also make us think about how the cost-benefit analysis, as it's taken into account, might be useful on average, but might also overlook the situation of subgroups of customers that should actually be taken into account. But to build upon this, so based on this assumption now that we've quantitatively measured that there is a gap in the perception of safety, this allows us to use again new studies of gender. And so we have two other projects, one measuring the impact of the Me Too scandal on people's perception of safety, and then we look at the cycling behaviors in New York City. And I decided to talk a bit about that because I'm actually interested to know if you have comments because you live in the city. And so, so a couple of words about the Me Too paper. So we use the same data, the customer satisfaction survey. And so why do we use the Me Too scandal? When you think of the Me Too scandal, you might think of the cinema industry, Hollywood. However, when you look at the keywords association of Me Too and public transport, you might see that it's been subject to a big press coverage at the same time as the Me Too scandal. And again, when you look at the web search intensity, according to Google Trends, this sparked a lot of research, so showing that there was a big press coverage and that also individuals were treated, they knew about that. So a couple of words about this situation. So in this case, we focus on European cities because that's where the press coverage on harassment in public transport, going hand in hand with the Me Too movement, was the biggest. And so in this case, we assume that women are the treated group and that men are the control group, because even if they are subject to information, it is women who are more likely to actually revise their stated preferences. So that's why we consider they are treated. And so what we do, we use a difference in differences method, and we find that there is a 2.5% increase in the probability to find that stations and trains are unsafe. Again, we focus on metros. And we find that there is a 2.1 increase in probabilities to be dissatisfied with the metro overall after the scandal happened. So it's quite paradoxical, because you might think that the Me Too movement then sparked the debate and that people will feel safer and they will feel better because they speak about their negative experiences. However, we find that the satisfaction decreases. But on the flip side, when transport providers actually work on something and they try to come up with a decision, they look at indicators it's all like the green lights versus the red lights. However, when they find more information, may actually help people voice out their opinions, which might be then more picked up as issues to work on. So that's basically the paradox, and then the good thing, the potential good thing provided by an informational shock. So we find, again, when we look at the level of crime at the city level, as well as the number of violent acts committed in the metro, we find that it does not affect, there are no heterogeneous effects based on that. However, in cities and in countries where the press coverage was bigger, the response was much more important, which shows that the channel is an informational one, and so this is not a story that's necessarily about crime, it's a story that's about information, the context, and what is the norm to which people might refer when it comes to when this states that they are happy or not. So the mean revealed preferences depend on the context. And so that's looking at the informational shock, but then we also have a project looking at infrastructure. So again, in this case, we rely on a different data set. We don't use customer satisfaction survey, but we look at people's actual behavior. So those two graphs indicate that there's been jointly over the last few years an increase in the infrastructure enabling people to ride safely their bikes, and also an increase in the gender balance. So it shows that there is potentially more people cycling, and also that the gender composition of those riders also has changed over time. So there might have been then a differentiated reaction to the availability of an infrastructure that makes cycling safer. And at first glance, when we look at this, we might think that, well, there is an increase in bike lanes, but women are more likely to pick up a bike when they see a bike lane compared to men. And this is something that we try and see and test whether that's true or not. So to do so we have city bike data, and so the number of rides and so on, and we use panel methods in order to control for the characteristics of the road, of time, and so on. And we find so far that when there is a new standard bike lane that's been opened, the share of women significantly increases, and also the number of women increases. So it's not just an increase in the number of riders, it's also that the women appear to maybe pick up the existence of that infrastructure more than their male counterparts. And so, so this is still early stages, but we find that a sort of portable elasticity is that when there is a 1% increase in standard lanes, the share of women using their bikes increases by 0.04%. And when a bike lane on a given route goes from standard to being fully standardized, as in so what's defined as standard is just you have you don't necessarily have a lane, but you have a little logo allowing bikes on the road. And so when this route has a bike lane, then you're more likely to have more women, and you will have 6 more women present on a given road. So it shows that women's response to bike infrastructure appears to be stronger. So I know these topics are acting or trying to find relationships between both perceptions and actual demand, and try to reconcile responses on those two levels. And I'm happy to hear out your questions, and thank you for your attention.
I just have a question on the women-only cars. I think that's the second slide that you're showing.
Yes, yeah.
So when you do a literature review, is there any kind of before and after study showing that are women-only cars, are they really useful actually to improve safety?
Yeah. So actually, the literature most of the time says that in principle it is good, but when it comes to talking to practitioners and people, for instance, for the case of Delhi, when we've exchanged with people from Delhi Metro, and the truth is that they only have one carriage, and so at peak time, given that there is a lot of people around, there tend to be men who also get in this women-only carriages. So it's difficult. That's why like they've implemented some sort of wardens to try and contain that. But this has triggered a lot of issues. And also, for instance, for the case of Delhi, there's only like the ridership that's constituted of women is just 20%. And also most of the time when they travel, they tend to travel with a male with them. So that's why then it's a bit more tricky, and this impairs the if you want to check whether there is an actual treatment or not, it makes it more complicated.
Yeah, because the reason why I ask is because I think I read an article about Japan's case just like 2 weeks ago. So they're claiming that there's actually a decreasing trend of women using their women-only car. Yes, they think, as you said, like it's too crowded, there's just too much perfume because there are a lot of ladies in the same car, and they don't really necessarily feel safer. That's some of the reasons they listed. I'm just wondering like if there's any quantitative, analysis on that.
Yeah, so
I know there's a lot of debate.
Exactly, and also for the case of Mexico, they've also had the same issue. That's why they have like dedicated female police members who are acting like trying to police the presence of men and women in metro carriages. So yes, this is the problem is that in those countries, this goes hand in hand with the fact that it's overcrowded. So that's why it kind of impairs the policy implication. Yeah.
The data do you have? Are there like any information about the individuals?
Yes.
So
Yeah.
like in terms of like the employment, time of day that they typically use.
Yeah. So we have data regarding the age. What is the main whether like they are daily users or rare users, like again like there's a different modes, different intensities, and we also know whether they are commuters, if they use it for work or not, and we find differentiated responses based on that. So for instance, younger people tend to say that they are less satisfied. People who are daily commuters tend to also be less satisfied, and that makes sense because they're more likely to have a negative experiences happening to them. And also for the Me Too analysis, we find that the response of people is bigger when for younger people and who are daily commuters. So this is potentially also because they have a bigger access to information and are more likely to have had a negative experience that they might be then willing to share if in a different climate.
Also any like data on income?
Unfortunately, we don't have that. Yeah. That's the issue. So we are. So this has been suggested. So this data initially has been produced to be used by our benchmarking group, because in our group we have people from the academic part and then people who are doing basically consulting for those companies. And so we've been trying to suggest that they should implement those controls. Yes.
For the bicycle one, do you also consider the location of the bike lanes? Like, for example, what might happen, from what I've read in the literature review, is that women tend to avoid, even though there's bicycle lanes and infrastructure, they avoid neighborhoods that are not considered that safe. And also, something else is the number of stations, city bike stations is also some other factor that I've seen is that women tend to have shorter trips. They tend to cycle less miles than men.
Yeah. So just from our descriptive statistics coming from the data, so also our analysis focuses on so we look at the trips that were taken in Manhattan, because then we could also infer more easily what could be the pattern, because it's more straight lines. So that's the assumption that we used so far. But yes, indeed, women on average tend to travel on shorter routes. But again, we are hoping to merge this with crime data and try and see if there is an impact of that, definitely. And also another control is that we want to look at the time of the day and see whether like implementing an infrastructure would then encourage women to actually cycle at later times of at night or something like that. Yeah, definitely. That's a good question. Yes.
So the data for this model is from different cities across the world.
Yes.
So the items like total staff in stations, ridership, these variables in the model.
Yes, yeah, they are, because so in the key performance indicators we have this information provided by the transport systems and on a yearly basis. So that's why we can use them as controls. But we also use controls at the city level that could encompass both intrinsic differences in perceptions that could be cultural, and also differences as in the way or the importance of the metro system. Because, for instance, when it comes to Europe, users are more likely to come from all walks of life, whereas in other cities it can be maybe poorer people who are users. So that's where the fixed effects come into place. But we have those as variables, yeah.
Yeah, sure. Because it seems many variables are related to the city size. Because usually it's total and total ridership and total number of variance X may be from total system or total city.
Yeah. Yeah.
It's kind of related to the how large the system is.
So you're thinking like in terms of per capita or something?
Yeah, it's maybe that divided by the total ridership of the whole system.
Yeah. So what we have done, there was at some point we did the metro ridership over the total population of the city, and we found also a similar impact, and something that was also significant. But it's true that it might be better to probably put the figure for something that is per capita. That could also be possible. Yeah, but we also find something that was positive and significant.
Yeah, that's why I think the viral impacts of population.
Yeah, per capita. Yeah. Yeah, fair.